There is a document, folded and refolded so many times that its creases have become soft as cloth, sitting in an archive in St. Petersburg. It is a marriage contract, written in a flowing Cyrillic hand, dated to the middle of the 18th century, drawn up somewhere in the vast continental interior that European cartographers of the era would have labeled, without much ceremony or precision, as Tartaria. The document lists property. It lists obligations. It lists the names of families. What it does not contain, in any of its careful columns and clauses, is a single word about the feelings of the two people whose lives it was binding together. Not one phrase of tenderness, not one acknowledgement that the woman whose name appears near the bottom of the parchment had ever been consulted. And when you hold that absence up against the grandeur of the civilization that supposedly surrounded it, and the golden domes and the impossibly refined stonework and the resonant halls of the buildings that still stand across Eurasia today, attributed to later hands and later centuries, you begin to feel the full weight of a world we have almost entirely forgotten. Let us start, as we always must, with the maps. If you pull up a copy of the 1706 atlas, compiled by the cartographer Nicolas de Fer, or if you look closely at the earlier Hondius plates that circulated throughout the 17th century, you will find that the space between the Caspian Sea and the Pacific Ocean, stretching from the northern forests down through the steppes and into the mountain passes of Central Asia, is labeled with the consistency that most people today find deeply surprising. It is labeled Tartaria, not as a vague ethnic description, not as a marginal note, but as a geographic and political entity with its own subdivisions. There is independent Tartaria, Muscovite Tartaria, and Chinese Tartaria. Okay, there are rivers and settlements named with a confidence that implies knowledge, which implies contact, which implies a world of sustained relationship between this interior civilization and the European powers that were drawing these maps. The 1771 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, that monument of Enlightenment confidence, dedicates a substantial entry to Tartary, describing it as the largest country in the world. Think about that for a moment. The largest country in the world. And today, most educated adults in the Western world could not tell you it existed at all. What was daily life like inside that vast cartographic space in, say, 1741? This is where we must be honest about the limits of what we know, and equally honest about the limits of what we have been taught. The official historical narrative gives us the Silk Road in its decline, a scattering of tribal confederacies, the long shadow of the Mongol legacy fading into irrelevance. But the maps do not draw irrelevant places with that much care, and the buildings do not build themselves. When you stand before certain structures in Kazan, or Bukhara, or Samarkand, or even in the older quarters of cities as far west as Budapest and as far east as the Manchurian Basin, you encounter stonework and proportion and decorative sophistication that the official timeline struggles to account for. And behind every carved stone pillar, yes, behind every vaulted ceiling with its geometric perfection, there were people living lives of staggering complexity. People who were born into obligations they had no part in choosing. People, and particularly women, who understood the architecture of power not as an abstraction, but as the daily condition of their existence. In 1741, across the territories that European maps still called Tartaria, a young woman approaching marriageable age would have understood something that her counterparts in the salons of Paris or London were only beginning to articulate through literature and philosophy. She would have understood that the institution of marriage was not a romance. It was a treaty. The great irony is that the civilization which supposedly surrounded her, the one whose material sophistication we can still observe in the surviving structures of Central Asia, may have been organized around principles of cosmic and spiritual harmony that included a reverence for the feminine and the domestic that more dominant historical narratives have entirely suppressed. Some researchers into what we might call the older world, the pre-reset civilization glimpsed in those maps and those buildings, point to the extraordinary decorative programs of certain Central Asian structures as evidence of a culture that honored the sacred role of women in ways that do not square with the purely martial and transactional account we have inherited. And yet, the marriage contract remains. The woman's name near the bottom. No love letters, no choice. We should sit for a moment with that phrase. No choice. Because it is one of the most resonant silences in the historical record of the interior Eurasian world. The political and economic logic of marriage in this era, and across almost every culture within the Tartarian geographic sphere, was not fundamentally different from the logic of alliance and property that governed such arrangements in Europe or China, or the Ottoman territories. A family with land or livestock or trade connections needed to secure those assets against uncertainty. The uncertainty was considerable. The 18th century interior of Eurasia was not a peaceful garden. The expansion of the Russian Empire under Peter, and then under Anna Ivanovna, and then under the extraordinary decades of Catherine, was pressing steadily into the steppe territories. The borders of what the maps called Tartaria were not merely shrinking cartographically. They were being renegotiated in fire and displacement, in the long, slow violence of colonial absorption that we rarely discuss with the same candor we apply to other colonialisms of that era. In this context, a marriage was quite literally a survival strategy. The family that contracted well might maintain its position, its lands, its identity. The family that failed to secure the right alliances might find itself without the social scaffolding it needed when the pressures came. And the pressures were coming from every direction. And the young woman at the center of these negotiations would have been educated in the management of a household that was, in the grander settlements of the region, not a simple dwelling but a complex institution. There is evidence in travelers' accounts from this period and in the records of Russian administrators moving into freshly absorbed territories of domestic interiors that were furnished with a care and an aesthetic sophistication that surprised their observers. Textiles of extraordinary quality, metalwork that implied a technical tradition of considerable depth, the organization of interior domestic space that reflected cosmological principles with specific orientations and materials assigned to specific functions. This is where the architectural mystery intersects with the intimate history. If we accept, even provisionally, the framework that certain researchers propose, and that the grand neoclassical and Baroque structures found across the globe in the 19th century were not built by the civilization that claimed credit for them, but inherited from an earlier and more technically advanced world, then the domestic interiors of Central Asian households in 1741 begin to look less like the simple dwellings of a nomadic or semi-nomadic people, and more like the surviving domestic expression of a much larger and more sophisticated material culture. Not the same instinct that placed geometric perfection into the vaulted ceilings of the great urban structures might have expressed itself in the carpet patterns and the metalwork, and the arrangement of rooms that travelers described with such surprised admiration. When an empire falls, its aesthetic logic does not disappear overnight. It migrates into the domestic, into the handmade,
like this?
into the
Yes,
things
that's
that
it. Now
women
pull it
carry
out,
and
see?
create and teach their daughters. And there is a particular category of object that appears repeatedly in the inventories and descriptions of Central Asian households in this period that deserves our attention. It is the dowry chest. Carved, painted, or worked in metal, these chests were the portable archive of a woman's status and identity. They traveled with her when she left her family's home. They held the physical evidence of the life she was leaving and the resources she was bringing to the life she was entering. In many descriptions, these chests are noted for a quality of craftsmanship that the observers considered remarkable, a level of technical precision and decorative complexity that implied training and tradition of significant depth. These were not objects made quickly. They were objects made across years, often beginning when a girl was still a child, by accumulating the evidence of skill and patience and cultural knowledge that would be her only true possession when the contract was signed and her name appeared at the bottom of the page with no love letters and no choice. The question of what women in 1741 Tartaria actually knew and believed and experienced of love is one that the surviving record makes very difficult to answer directly. What we have are contracts and administrative notes and travelers' impressions, and the occasional passage in a literary or religious text that touches on the emotional life of the interior. What we can infer is more interesting. A civilization of the complexity implied by both the maps and the surviving material culture would have had its own sophisticated understanding of the interior life. The traditions of Persian poetry were not foreign to the educated classes of Central Asian urban centers. The concept of a passionate and devoted love, idealized and spiritualized, was well understood in the literary culture that overlapped with the Tartarian geographic sphere. The distance between that literary ideal and the lived reality of a marriage contract in 1741 was not unique to this region. It was the universal condition of women across almost every documented civilization of the era. The love letter existed as a genre precisely because love and marriage were understood to be separate categories of experience. But there is something specific to the situation of 1741 that adds a particular weight to the silence of those contracts. This was a world in transition, and the people living in it could feel the transition even if they could not name it in the terms we would use today. The Russian administrative presence was extending into territories that had previously governed themselves under different principles. On the trade routes that had connected the interior of Eurasia to both the eastern and western markets were being disrupted and redirected. The category of Tartaria that had appeared on European maps for 2 centuries was in the process of being dissolved, not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic event, but in the slow administrative grinding that turns a named and recognized political space into an unnamed collection of subject territories. So a woman marrying in 1741 in this world was marrying not only into a family, but into an uncertainty about whether the structures that gave that family its meaning and its position would still be standing in any recognizable form by the time her daughters came of age. This is the layer of the Tartarian mystery that most explorations of the subject tend to skip past in their enthusiasm for star forts and mud flood windows and atmospheric energy towers. The human layer, or the layer of people living inside the enormous structures that their civilization had built or inherited, navigating the very ordinary and the very extraordinary at the same time, falling into love or failing to, being handed a contract and asked to sign it, carrying a carved chest across a threshold into a life they had not chosen and could not refuse. Every great architectural enigma has this interior. Every building that amazes us with its scale and sophistication was once full of people who had not slept well, who were arguing about water rights, who were arranging marriages for their children with as much calculation and as little sentimentality as the situation required. When we look at the surviving architectural expressions of the Tartarian world, the tiled facades of the great mosques and caravanseries, the proportioned interiors of the administrative buildings that were absorbed into the Russian imperial system, the domestic complexes whose sophisticated organization surprised European observers, we are looking at the frame that held all of those human lives in place. The building does not tell you about the woman whose name is near the bottom of the contract, but the building and the contract come from the same civilization, the same understanding of order and obligation and beauty, in the same world that could produce extraordinary geometric perfection in stone and also a complete absence of tenderness in the document that determined the entire course of a young woman's life. That tension between the grandeur of what was built and the silence at the center of what was lived is perhaps the most honest introduction to the full depth of what we have lost in the forgetting of Tartaria. Not just the empire on the maps, not just the buildings whose origins we cannot quite account for, but the full human complexity of a world that was real and intricate and capable of both extraordinary beauty and ordinary cruelty, and that we have been taught to treat as though it barely existed at all. The next time you see an old map with that familiar label stretched across the heart of the continent, do not just marvel at the territory. Think of the people inside it. Think of the woman with no love letters and no choice, and carrying her carved chest into the rest of her life. She was real, and so was the world she lived in.